recording.
I decided to use some different headphones. Oh, we're recording. Here we go.
We're
Uh,
talking about hair and headphones,
yeah, yeah.
but that
Apparently,
is not our our topic for today. Is not hair and headphones, although it could be a
no.
topic.
Although they are both issues, because yeah, they are just getting a haircut when you've got ME is a challenge, isn't it?
I have not had
Sorry.
a hair. My hair is longer than it's been since I was. It's longer than it's been in at least 30 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. No, I do need a haircut, and I think my wife's gonna maybe do it this weekend. So we'll see, because she taught herself to cut hair.
That's
When
awesome.
realised I just couldn't. It was just like the whole process of just going to a barber shop, and it must be hard. It must be even harder for women that have got ME as well. I mean, like, for me, it's kind of, for men, it's like you go and you sit and wait, and then you get your haircut, and then you come out again. Whereas like women are often in there a lot longer, aren't they? So depending on what they want
Yeah,
doing.
and then
So
there's all the smells and the sound.
oh
It's like
yeah,
so much of us.
hair
I think
dye.
for me, I don't think I could do it sensory wise to go even to a barber shop. But like if you're
Yeah,
going to a place where they do like any kind of dyeing or perms or
yeah,
anything like that,
yeah,
it must
yeah,
be awful. And then you have to worry about getting like catching like what do you call that? Like COVID. You have to worry about
yeah,
um
yeah. It's massive. So yeah, so yeah, hair. I'm hoping to maybe get her a haircut this weekend. Yeah, but my wife hopefully will do it. Yeah, she's very good, and she basically sort of like spent ages watching YouTube videos, and then sort of turned a hand to it. So yeah,
that's great.
oh, I didn't even say welcome. This is
Hi.
we didn't do the starty bit, did we? So I'm Daniel, and this is Dov, and this is Post-Exertional Mayonnaise Podcast, a podcast about living with ME and chronic illness, creativity, and making meaning. So yeah, hello and
And
welcome.
hair.
And hair, yeah, talking about hair, and yeah, I thought I'd try out my headphones, which I got some new pads for, and the noise
Uh,
cancelling headphones. I've had these a few years, and they are really helpful when I kind of go out and about in the world, which isn't very often. So yeah, it's
I need to get
yeah,
new noise cancelers because mine are like falling apart at the
mm,
seams. They're just disintegrating.
yeah, yeah.
I get
It's
cheap ones. I should at some point invest in like a really nice pair, but I tend to get like the $20 pairs and then they break or
mm,
fall apart.
yeah, yeah. I
Um,
got these Bose ones because
oh,
at
they're
the time they were
Bose.
like, yeah, but it was actually my last. I got some tax back from my work after I became ill, and we had to sell our house because we couldn't afford to pay the mortgage and stuff like that anymore. And we moved into a caravan, and I sort of said to my wife, "Can I use some of this money it's basically sort of my last ever paycheck?" I sort of yeah, I bought a nice set of noise cancelling headphones, and they have been really good for when I've been like out and about and things like that. And yeah, I use them most days, so it's um yeah, don't have that sort of money anymore to spend on things like that. But
It's
yeah.
wild to think of your last paycheck, which goes so well with our topic today. But now I'm thinking about sort of the last the last paid work I ever did, which is,
Mm,
um, yeah, it's, it's what a strange thing to think about.
yeah, yeah. It's hard, isn't it, to think, oh, yeah, such a normal, basic thing for most humans is to kind of like work and get paid for that work, and that it's so out of reach sometimes for so many of us. And
Yeah.
I'm really pleased for the people with ME that can do some work, and it must feel like a real achievement, but it must also feel like absolutely exhausting as well to be sort of pushing yourself that hard to kind of have
Yeah.
to
I think it can be really,
um
it's like, I think there are a lot of costs to working. I mean, I think that if we lived in a culture where um, you weren't seen as valuable according to your productivity, if we lived in a culture where it was more normalized to kind of work I would love to live in a world where there was like a universal basic income and people didn't, there was, people weren't trying to work 40, 60, 80 hours a week or whatever just to get
Mm,
by. But yeah, I do have friends who work with ME, and it takes up most of their spoons, and it really makes it hard to kind of have a life outside of work. But I think there's also ways that I think it can give you a sense of agency and a sense of accomplishment as well.
mm,
Um, yeah.
mm. Yeah, it's hard, isn't it? I was it just made me think about talking about work. Is thinking about somebody that I studied on at university. I think like in my first year of uni or my second year of uni, and it's like we had to do like project board sort of thing and do a presentation about a certain philosopher or thinker or somebody that's kind of made a difference within the world of social work and things like that. And uh, I got kind of like somebody that's quite obscure called Ivan Illich, and
Oh,
Ivan
yeah.
Illich.
I know who that is.
Have we talked about Ivan Illich before? But
I don't know. I taught
um,
one of his essays about.
oh really?
Yeah, I taught one of his essays when I was in the MFA program and teaching first year composition,
Wow.
because he writes an essay about, it was something about the idea of oh, my brain, like, how a lot of people in the US go to other countries to quote do good, and they don't interrogate their
Mm,
own idea of their like beneficence and charity. It's kind of about, um we kind of did a whole section on, the problematic thing of the power dynamic and the thinking around quote charity, and particularly like
mm,
with the US going into countries that they basically destroyed and then seeing themselves as like saviors and heroes. Anyways, so he wrote.
mm. Yeah, yeah. He wrote all sorts of things. I was just googling him. He was an Austrian priest and theologian. So he was a very interesting guy. But he talked about like something called webs of learning, and he was born in like 1926, I think it says there. But sort of he did a lot of his work in sort of like the sort of 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, I think. Um, and he talks about like webs of learning and accessibility to education for people like across the world. And before the internet, really, it was like he was sort of thinking outside the box, really. But one of the things that you wrote was the right to useful unemployment. So you wrote an essay or a book about. I didn't read it, and but I kind of read synopsises and things like that. And yeah, I think his whole um, thing for that was about actually, I don't know if he was like a socialist or what, but it was almost the right having the right to useful unemployment, and that actually the not being a sort of like a slave to your salary or to your work or your income or whatever. But that I've like since I became ill, I've always like really appreciated that, and it's kind of reminded me about the value of what we do isn't about kind of just our income or our work. Maybe we should have like a maybe we could have like an episode where we talk about his work and we sort of like read his stuff and then we have a discussion about it. But it's
That'd
a
be
bit
great.
obscure. It's a bit obscure, but yeah,
Well, just
it
the idea
might be.
that our value comes from the kind of employment where we get a paycheck, which doesn't sort of
Hmm.
account for like all the other ways that our lives are valuable. And I think with ME, like there's useful unemployment, which is, like potentially being able to do the kind of, like do podcasts or write or, like do art, the kind of stuff that we're talking about in post-exertional mayonnaise. Seems like there's, I hope that this is recording anyways.
Yeah.
And then there's just the fact that some people can't do any work at all, and that doesn't make their lives meaningless or without value. And I
Hmm.
think, and then there's just like, for me, just being able to kind of have emotional connection and have conversations. Like, I would also love to just talk about the meaningfulness of having conversations and thinking with other people, and all the kinds
Hmm.
of ways that life has meaning for us, and then the existential component of that, or like the
Mm,
ways that what is it, and I think that's a lot of what this podcast is about, is making meaning. We're trying to
mm,
figure out how do we sort of feel like we're part of the world, if we have access to feeling like we're in
mm,
some way like part of a community or part of the world, or able to do some kind of creative stuff,
mm,
which those of us who can do that, I think, are pretty lucky with this illness.
mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I was actually thinking yesterday that we kind of have got this like tagline about being a podcast about ME and chronic illness and creativity and making meaning. And I thought, I don't know if we've actually really talked much about what it means to make meaning, or meaning making, um, on the podcast. And I thought, have we neglected that bit a bit? But I think like you just summarized it. That the whole thing is about making meaning, isn't it? Like whenever we speak to an author, or an artist or whatever, like we have been doing on the podcast, like that is all about making meaning, and it's about how we make sense of our lives to some degree with chronic illness, with the ME, and with the sort of levels of exhaustion that we have. That it's so good to like just speak to different people that are doing something, or try to create something despite what they're going through. But and
Right.
that's
Like,
not to sort of like
yeah.
sort of say that people don't who can't do anything aren't valued either. It's we're all on a different part of the journey, aren't we? And it's a challenge to do whatever we can when we're living with ME. Yeah.
Right. And to find, um like, for me, connecting with other people is like feels meaningful to me, and I don't know if that's just because I love sort of having conversations. Like, I love talking to you, and I love sort of,
Mm,
to me, there's a real creativity to just engaging in conversation with another human, because it's a
yeah.
way of sort of exploring what we know and sharing ideas, and kind of, it brings up all these memories, and like you remembering the last paycheck you ever got. Like, that, to me, that's something that wouldn't necessarily have come up in a context that wasn't like a conversation about work and life and meaning and me. And yeah, I think, sorry, I lost my train of thought, but I think doing this podcast is meaningful just in the act of creating community,
mm,
connecting with other people, and being part of something, but yeah, I think for me, like, any kind of learning feels meaningful. Any kind of conversations often tend to feel meaningful. Connecting, and certainly writing feels very meaningful when I'm able to do it. It is hard when I'm not able to do things that sort of bring me a sense of meaning. But I
mm,
think with this illness, one of the things we have to do is sort of be flexible around what feels meaningful, and try to kind of shift the shape of what it means to have a meaningful life, so that we are
yeah.
included in there no matter what our
Yeah.
condition is.
And I think one of the things we were going to talk about was like other people's perceptions of ourselves, and that almost like ties in. It's a bit of a segue, isn't it, from in terms of like how we see ourselves versus how other people see us, and how we see making meaning, and not then like taking on expectations of what other people think that our lives look like, or
Right.
how we live our lives. Um, because there can be so much pressure there, isn't there, in terms of like how do we express ourselves? How do we, to what extent do we explain to people about our illness? Whether that's like a delivery person, or
Mm.
somebody that we meet. I mean,
Yeah.
like, I had an interesting um, sort of experience last Saturday, because my wife was away for the weekend, and I managed to drive to the village to drop my son off with one of his friends, or his friend's parents, who with his friend who picked him up to take him to his basketball match. And the friend's mum's lovely, and she was like, "Oh, how you doing? How you doing?" And she's always like asking me how I am, um, And then she asked me again when I picked him up from the village as well when we met. And it's always like really hard. Like, how to what extent do you sort of like really express the true reality of your situation when you just see somebody for like 5 minutes like that, just having a quick chat, and then you sort of get back in your cars and you drive away, and you sort of think, how do I sort of like express the reality of my situation, or do I express the reality of my situation? Like, because if I if I said like if you said how are you doing, and I said, well, actually I'm doing a little bit better today because I'm able to actually literally drive for a couple of miles down the road and drive back again. Like that's a big thing for me. That's a big achievement sort of thing. And then, but if you say like to that person, I don't know what her understanding of ME is, or don't understand.
You do
Yeah,
that?
and she's like really, she's really concerned about how I'm doing and stuff. And I'm thinking like, how much do I explain? Like, kind of,
Right.
well, actually, like, uh, you know, my life is like, do you almost like seem a bit depressive by saying in itself like, oh, my life is actually really crap, and like this is the first time I've been out in 2 weeks, and like or do you sort of just like sort of it's like knowing kind of quite in each individual situation like how much to share and how much to
Right.
like. Do you think, do I start and try and like educate somebody about ME, or is this a chance to sort of raise awareness, or is it actually just a chance to sort of pick my son up and have a nice brief conversation with somebody and not have to make it about the illness all the time as well?
Right. And
um
then when you do share, I mean, I feel like if I do tell someone how badly I'm doing, then that becomes the focus. And even if I'm telling someone that, I don't necessarily want their pity or their like
yeah,
intrusive questions or, it's
yeah,
like, I think for me, there's this tension between wanting to be understood because it's
yeah.
frustrating when people don't understand the illness, but also just wanting to like not having to be sort of looked at in the way people look at me when I tell them how sick I am, where it's like,
mm,
I feel like I become sort of, yeah, it just becomes, it's weird. It's a weird thing to try to kind of get other people to understand the illness.
mm. It's kind of like
Um,
wanting a degree of like empathy from people, but also not wanting it to be like, oh yeah, not wanting to be pitied, but also w- wanting an accurate representation of the
right,
illness as well. So it's really difficult. And then actually sometimes you just want to relate to somebody without having to bring the illness into it.
right. But then something might
So
come up that's frustrating because they're like, "Oh, did you
yes,
go to that thing the other day?"
yeah,
And you're
yeah, yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
"No,"
yeah.
or they don't get it. They're like, you tell them you're homebound, and then they're like, "Oh, I'm going to this thing. You want to come?"
Mm,
And I'm, that happened to me. Um, I guess a little over a year ago, or maybe it was not this most recent Sukkot, but the last Sukkot. I think that's what it was. When I had a few people over to my house, and one of them was some friends wanted me to meet her. Um, and we texted a little before she came to my house for this little tiny get together outside. And for Sukkot, which is a Jewish holiday for anyone who doesn't know, it's in the fall, there are several Jewish holidays, and Sukkot is one of the last ones of the season that is generally spoken of as the high holidays, but loosely because it involves Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But in any case, okay, so people are coming to my house for a little tiny gathering, and one of them is someone my friends want me to meet, and we text, and she invites me to something, and I'm like, my friends had to have told her that I'm homebound and that I have ME.
mm,
You don't just say, "Oh, I have a friend I want you to meet," and don't kind
mm,
of give a little context. So I told her I can't, I'm homebound, and she asked me two or three other times if I wanted to go do something.
mm,
And at a certain point I was just like, I don't want to hang out with this person. I
mm.
don't like. And when she came over to the house, everybody was leaving and I was fucking wiped out. And she's like, "Why don't you come with us? We're going to the synagogue." And I was like, how many
Yeah.
like, and so I think it's really frustrating for people to not understand what it means to be homebound, to not understand the illness. I think there are some instances where I'm just like, if somebody's either too sort of over focused on my illness or can't hear that I'm sick, I'm just like, I don't want to be around you, you know?
Mm, mm. And then people that just don't acknowledge it at all. I mean, I don't really get that, but I was talking to a friend recently, and he was saying that he met up with some people, and like not one person asked him about his illness or how he was doing. It was like, he's kind of gone out, he's sort of gone out his way to be out there,
Yeah.
and that's really hard as well, isn't it? So it's like it's always difficult to kind of like know to manage other people's perceptions and to find friendships that are meaningful, but that actually people will acknowledge the illness and acknowledge kind of how hard that is on you, but
Yeah.
actually accept you as
Yeah.
for who you are as well. And maybe that is why we have so many online friendships because people are few and far between in terms of like getting that balance right. Hmm.
It's hard. It's hard. It's like I find even with very close friends who I've had for a while, they'll occasionally say something that's just mind boggling. Like I'll say that I was able to do a thing and they're like, oh, sounds like you're getting better. You know what I mean? And it's
Yeah.
just like, why? Like, why can't people just hold and sit with the reality of
Hmm.
chronicity? And, it's like, it's really sweet that some of my friends are like, how are you doing? If they come over to visit and they're like, how are you doing? Do you want me to leave? Do you need to rest? Like that, I feel like that kind of attunement can be so meaningful to me. But there's still, it's like the same people who do that might, you know, ask me if I'm doing better in a way that is like has an expectation that I'm somehow going to progressively improve, because people can't let go of this idea that like chronicity is does not involve progressive getting, some kind of narrative of progressive improvement. And yeah,
Hmm.
it's confusing. I think being social with this illness, in our last podcast we sort of talked about like why is it so hard to have friends with ME, and you had kind of like wondered why there's not more research done about sort of, I think the question of why non-chronically ill people have the like don't have the capacity to stay friends with chronically ill people. But
Hmm.
I'm also really interested in like the question of why it's so hard for chronically ill people to be friends with weller people, because it's like there's this sense of like people just stubbornly not getting it.
Hmm.
And that can be really alienating. Like I find that can be very alienating, even though I don't want someone to over focus on my symptoms and my illness and get fixy or get like overly pitying. Just to have that baseline understanding of what my life is like. Like I feel like if I can't have that in a relationship with someone where they don't have a baseline understanding of what my illness is, I find it really hard to stay connected.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's true. It's
Just
Yeah.
And people have such a hard time with chronicity. It's like, and I don't know why. I don't know. I mean,
Hmm.
I know culturally speaking, it's not taught. It's not learned. It's not, you don't grow up with this understanding that like unless you have a sick relative, you don't grow up, I think, with the understanding that, you know, anybody can get sick at any time and just, not get better.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I
And
wish
again,
there
it's
was,
like
yeah.
I think we've like talked before, isn't haven't we, about like people's perceptions about people with ME and chronic illness about a desire to get better, or and that kind of this an awful lot of people will have seen this article that came out yesterday, Tuesday the 12th of March in the Guardian by George Monbiot, Biot, um, uh, and the headline is "You don't want to get better. The outdated treatment of ME in CFS patients is a national scandal, and well, an international scandal actually." So,
Yeah.
um, and we'll put a link to that, and it's such a validating article in terms of like the experiences of those people, those of us with ME over the last like 20, 30 years. And, going, yeah, literally going back to the sort of like the 80s and what people experienced in terms of sort of like medical gaslighting and yeah, for it to be sort of called the greatest scandal, medical scandal of the 21st century is just is yeah is incredible. It's in fascinating, and I'm really pleased that George has kind of like stepped out there
Yeah.
and done this article.
It's just
I did
wild
have
that
it.
somebody wrote I think it was a dissertation, I forget, like somebody wrote something in, I think he said it was the 70s. I had heard it was the 80s, but in any case, because I've talked about this with people before, this art, like somebody wrote a dissertation claiming that Emmy was hysteria,
Mm,
and they had no valid research. They wrote this thing, it was not researched in any way that could pass as like valid or meaningful research, but people just glommed onto it like as true. And this is a thing that can happen. This is why it's so dangerous for false information to go out into the world. I was There's a funny example of this, which is there's this sort of story that's been going around that giant sloths, that the people trying to figure out, where do avocados come from, why are they so big, and so
yeah.
some scientists came up with this narrative that giant sloths ate avocados and pooped out the seeds, because that's why the seeds are so big, because they were eaten by giant sloths, and everybody um, copied this narrative and just took it as true, even though there was no
Yeah.
valid research. And then once research was done, like by the time research was done, it was just a given fact in, even in like scientific community, that this was a true story, and it's not a true story at all. And once
Mm,
people did research, they found out, actually, like, for thousands and thousands of years, humans have been cultivating avocados, and that is why they're so
yeah.
big. it's
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
um it's a story of human cultivation. But I think that information can get out into the world that has no basis in reality.
Mm,
But if some scientists just take it as truth, or like the narrative, it maybe it benefits them in some way, or maybe it goes along with their ideas about the world or about people, then it just sort of becomes a story that's, quote, true, without any basis in fact. And then this narrative has been so tenacious, this narrative that, like, people with ME they don't want to get better, they're not trying to get better, it's psychosomatic, it's psychological, it's hysterical, and it's based on nothing. It's based on nothing.
mm,
It's based on something somebody wrote with no basis in fact, and yet people have glommed onto it. And even after it's been disproven with actual research and facts, people still hold on to it. And a lot of, it's like still a very solidly believed um, thing in a lot of medical communities. And it's like we're still fighting this dumb fucking
mm,
story that somebody told, some asshole.
mm,
And in the article that Dan's talking about, it's great because he talks about the fact that one of the reasons this narrative was able to take off is because ME affects women more than it affects men.
mm,
To put it,
mm.
I know that, like, for me as a trans guy, I don't like using language that's that binary, but it
Yeah.
does, I think, affect people who are assigned female at birth more than it affects people who are assigned male at birth.
Mm,
And therefore it's much easier for medical communities to dismiss it, which I think also happened with MS. And I think it's just a very, I'm glad that he talks about that.
mm,
And yeah, I think he did a great job of naming a few names of people who have continued to sort of peddle this false narrative. For And Dan and I we're talking about that a little. Dan, do you want to say anything about that?
no, no. Dunno, I'm trying to think what we were talking about before, but
About Sharp and Wesley and Sharp, fucking
Wesley
Wesley and
Sharp.
Sharp. those,
Yeah, let's.
those,
I mean, yeah, George has named them in the article, so yeah, it almost seems that there's been like like you said, long after this approach was debunked in scientific literature, clinicians who championed it have refused to let it go. This like, sort of psychologization of it, and they continue to influence healthcare systems, governments, and health insurers, and patients still suffer as a result. So just that statement in itself in a national newspaper article is such a validating thing, and you know, I've seen stuff online about those individuals kind of like being almost part of like a cabal that directed public health policy in the UK for years, which then impacted health policy across the world.
Yeah.
And it's so damaging, and quite why that has held such a sway. I'm really looking forward to in the next 2 3 weeks. Hopefully, haven't got a date yet, but I'm going to be speaking to my childhood paediatrician, who was Dr. Nigel Spate, and one of the things I was really keen to talk to him about, and he's done a lot of work over the last 30 odd years around uh, challenging systems and issues for particularly like parents where there's been like what they would have called back in the days like Munchausen's by proxy, or now it's often called
Yeah.
fabricated or induced illness, where parents are basically accused of creating an illness or condition in their child to
Mm.
get attention, to get and it is a very rare thing, but it does happen that parents kind of play on imaginary illnesses in their children to kind of feed their own sense of self-worth, I suppose, and that is true. But for so many with children, young people with ME, there's been cases where social care has kind of gone in, and there's been threats of removal of children, particularly in Scandinavia as well. There's been cases of children, young people being in Finland, I
Yeah.
think it is, of being kind of removed from the parents. One young woman was literally sort of like taken away for years, I think. And she just had ME, and it does, it makes you so angry, and it makes you very frustrated that this narrative was still out there,
Yeah.
years and years later. So,
Mm.
yeah, as and when I speak to Dr. Spate, it'll be really interesting to kind of get his perspective on why those views have become so entrenched within
Yeah.
medical services, and also I'm be interested to speak to him to kind of find out, if he feels that there's a culture shift happening towards more compassionate care, I suppose we might want to say, or whether that the culture is so embedded that it's going to take an awful long time, despite the nice guidelines, for things to change. So,
Right.
yeah, yeah,
Right.
it'll be
Like
interesting.
in the article, he mentions that nurse who basically calls ME patients bastards for not wanting to get better, and I think like it, just recently, like in the last 6 months, I was sort of trying to help. I was trying to support this family who was trying to get medical care for this probably this woman in maybe her 30s,
Mm,
who has severe ME and was trying to get a feeding tube. And like in 2023, in a hospital, like this family was being, the doctors were blaming this family for encouraging their daughter, like making up this, their daughter made up this story, daughter slash granddaughter. It was a grandma and a ma helping, and a mother helping, granddaughter, daughter, 30-year-old woman. And the doctors and nurses were just like, she's making this up and you're encouraging her, like that very
mm,
same story.
mm,
Um, and I wonder what does it take? What does it take to change the culture of like anger towards a patient for being sick, anger towards a family for trying to take care of a sick patient? Does it take like a sort of set of guidelines of care? Like, does it take like this is how you care for somebody with severe ME and something that people can follow? Like, or does it take an attitude shift, like a larger cultural medical attitude shift? Is it possible to get to a point where people aren't blamed for their illness, people aren't told that they're making it up, like,
Mm,
and how much of this is specific to ME, and in particularly severe ME, and how much of this sort of has echoes in other illness situations? Like,
mm,
I think I have a lot of questions, but it's like, clearly people are dying because their illness, their ME is not being taken seriously,
mm,
um and there's just so much harm being done in the name of, like, medical staff feeling the need to sort of see themselves as having more knowledge about somebody else's condition, and sort of like wielding power over, like a nurse
mm,
that calls patients bastards, saying they don't want to get better, is somebody who's in a power struggle, who sees themselves as somebody with the correct information and
yeah.
knowledge in a power struggle with people who are being resistant. That narrative of
Mm,
resistance to um, help, resistance to getting better, resistance to these false sort of, like, people resistant to, like, graded exercise treatment, when clearly it's just going to harm people. Yeah.
mm.
Sorry, I went off, but
No, 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 no. Yeah, it's just there's somehow somewhere along the line like a real lack of a loss of compassion, and a lack of compassion, and ability just to actually, you know, um, see the patient as a person and listen to them, and kind of actually, um, sort of like, assessing the situation, and like, from a social work perspective, like, back in the day, a lot of my social work training was about like person-centered care, those sort of buzzwords that came around, and personalization, and holistic therapies, holistic care, holistic assessment, seeing the person as an individual, and treating them as an individual with their individual needs. All those sort of stuff were kind of like anti-oppressive practice. All these sort of buzzwords that kind of were really, central to our, going out there into the world of social work, and sort of like, having this sort of toolkit kind of in your sort of back pocket sort of thing, and then actually seeing the reality of life on the front lines of social work, and kind of then also seeing from the other perspective, seeing the medical profession and stuff. It just feels, uh, like we're all in like a system, except we're not in a system because we're just absolutely rejected and neglected as people with ME. It's like we're sort of the bottom of the pile, in terms of like, yeah, how we're seen, how we're treated, the whole fabricated illness in, parents of children with ME, but also like then, as adults, kind of like, how that sort of stigma sticks with you as well, in terms of like being seen to be trying to be some sort of, I don't know, benefit fraud. I mean, it's like, it's incredible to even kind of think along those lines, because it's just so hard to get. I don't know
like,
about
benefits,
from
like, first of all,
it's
it's
just,
not like you're getting $1 million.
why
It's
would you
like,
want this to claim to have this condition that nobody believes that you've got in the first place? It's like,
right, maybe if they were like giving out $3 million a year, giving you a butler, like, it, like, it's such an absurd kind of. But I think, like, people feel resentful because, it's the same thing where, like, when I first got ME, and we're going to talk about anniversaries again, and I think we're going to
mm,
not be able to do that
yeah,
again. But when I first got ME, before I knew I had ME, and I was so wiped out, and I trying to explain to people that I'm tired, and got so many of those, well, I'm tired too, but I'm coming to
yeah,
work and I'm doing this, and it's like, I think people I think we're in a system that makes people resentful. because people feel
Mm,
like they're competing for resource sources. We could live in a system that didn't make people feel resentful when they
mm,
see a sick person, but they see somebody who's disabled or sick, and they're like, that person is taking my resources away from,
yeah,
there's this real kind of cruelty that comes from dehumanization and resentment, that comes from the kind of economic health system we're living in, I think. And
mm,
it makes it very hard for people to, and then they imagine, like, we're stealing benefits and that's taking their tax money. And
yeah,
and these people, like, I think there's so many false beliefs in there, but it's, I think it's kind of um something that's culturally, it's culturally kind of, um how do you say, like, people force these belief systems into people, because then people don't go after the actual people who are stealing your money, which is
yeah,
like CEOs,
yeah,
like, uh, big corporations and billionaires, and
yeah,
not to get all political, but, and the other thing is like, because of this sense of resentment, people are always monitoring. It's like my friend, who has ME, and like went to conference using a wheelchair, and he got out of his wheelchair to go to the bathroom, and some guy comes in the bathroom and sees somebody left their wheelchair outside the bathroom, and is like, you're not really disabled, and physically threw the wheelchair. I mean, wheelchairs cost a lot of fucking
oh
money.
man,
It's not, it's not like we're given wheelchairs freely because we have ME. No one's gonna, so this
no,
person, like, saved up money, did crowdfunding, all this stuff to get a wheelchair, and this guy throws it against the wall because he thinks he's not really disabled, and, like, because he went into the bathroom without his
oh
wheelchair.
man,
And there's this kind of, um there's this simmering rage that people
mm,
have, because they feel like it's their job, and they get to decide whether someone else is disabled enough, whether they're, you know what
mm,
I mean? Does that make sense,
yeah,
what I'm trying to say?
yeah, and 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 it is perpetuated by, particularly in in this country with our government. It's time, and even the last couple of weeks, there's been more statements by ministers about getting people off the benefits culture and all
Yeah.
this sort of stuff. And then there was a really interesting snippet of a radio phone in with a guy called James O'Brien, who's he's kind of more of a left leaning kind of radio presenter in this country, and somebody had rung in to complain about a family member. I think it might have been like a sister-in-law or a sister or something like that, or a friend, so supposed friend, who was on benefits and getting housing benefit, and she, I don't know if she was disabled or not, but she was basically like complaining about the fact that they had to work so hard as as a couple to pay their bills and stuff, and then this other person's basically getting the housing paid for, and getting money, and they've got these kids that are being looked after, that they've got money for and stuff. And it was like, and James O'Brien did such a good job of basically sort of saying, hang on a minute, like, why are you punching down? Why are you sort of like, why are you sort of basically looking down on the person that's really struggling and complaining that they're getting support, when you're not looking up at the people who are basically making your life more difficult, because you're struggling to make ends meet, because like the cost of living's gone up, and bills are going up, and everything like that. Why aren't you looking at the companies, the oil companies that are making billions and billions in profit, and yet they're not cutting the rates that they're charging to people?
Yeah.
Why are we not looking at the MPs who are making money out of second houses in this country? Or why are we not looking at, there's a whole like plethora of different situations where people are seemingly kind of like making loads of money off the average person, and getting away with it. And yeah, we said we weren't going to get political, but it's frustrating, isn't it,
Right.
when actually it is ultimately those of us that are receiving disability benefits that are being demonized.
Right.
And I'm sure it's probably a similar case with you in the US as well as here in the UK, that
Yeah.
are then made to feel that pressure by a government governments who are clearly sort of scapegoating individuals,
Yeah.
for the purposes of lining their own pockets. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
I was just thinking like the rules for talking about disability should be the same rules as talking about comedy, which is that people should be punching up. You don't
yeah.
punch down in comedy. I mean, you do if you're fucking assholes who I could name a few of, but yeah, it's people, but people are sort of trained to punch down in those ways because it keeps the wealthy people, as you say, lining their pockets and not having repercussions for sort of impoverishing nations.
Mm,
um
mm,
just it's sad, and it's desperately terrifying. It's terrifying, like so many of us would be homeless without our benefits, and so many people are homeless on benefits or barely.
mhm,
It's like the benefits are often like not even close to enough for people to live on, and in
yeah.
an ideal world everybody would have enough to live on, um and people wouldn't be feeling desperate enough to like throw someone's wheelchair against the wall. There's I think that
Mm,
speaks of sort of rage and desperation,
mm,
from living in a culture that's sort of um, doesn't care about people's sort of basic quality of life and people's basic needs getting met. And I wish
yeah.
we lived in a culture where it was just a given that everybody had housing, and nice everybody has housing, food, transportation. um it's I think I know I'm gonna yeah, I don't know, I think it's there's kind of a people get angry at disabled people, and I don't know if it's because it's like why are we such a target of people's sort of
Mm,
rage,
mm.
and like why are people who sort of worship, what's his face? What's the dude? The billionaire who's trying to move to Mars or whatever? Elon
Oh,
Musk. Like,
Elon Musk.
why are people like
Yeah.
raging at me and like worshiping Elon Musk?
Yeah.
I won't ever understand. But which brings us back to people in positions of power who misuse their power, which goes back to Wesley and Sharp, which is like people who
Mm,
have been spreading this narrative that ME isn't a quote real illness, which does put us in a position of sort of being targeted by a lot of angry people, angry healthcare workers,
mm,
angry family members, angry. Lots of angry people target us because of this narrative that our illness isn't real, and
mm,
this narrative is perpetuated by people who should know better, people who
mm,
are in positions of power, who refuse to look at evidence and refuse to change their story, and who really do, as this article that Dan was talking about, who really are having a huge influence on medical care, and
mm,
so I guess it's coming from all directions, but I think it puts us in a pretty hard position, like socially, emotionally, economically, medically, to just um, to not only have it be hard to get any kind of appropriate medical care, but to have people actually enraged at us for um, trying to take care of ourselves in the most basic way.
mm. Yeah,
Um,
definitely. I'm really excited to have also to let you know. I don't know if I've mentioned this to you yet. But, I'm going to be speaking to Nicola, Jeffrey, and Steve Topple, and they are sort of activists for the chronic collaboration, and they do a lot of campaigning and things like that. So they're going to be coming on the podcast as well soon, and I
When
just
are
need to
they
kind of
coming
arrange.
on?
I haven't got a date yet, so I just need to arrange with them. But yeah, they've sort of agreed to come on, and
And
they've
when
done
are
a
you
lot of work.
talking? Oh, sorry, go on.
No, I was just gonna say they've done a lot of work. Sort of recently, they were talking. They did a joined campaign about disabled benefit deaths and stuff. So they were like outside Parliament in London. So like really appreciate they've done a lot of work on ME as well. So really appreciate the work that they've done. So yeah, looking forward to speaking to them as well. And
That's great. I mean,
having another a rage cast, I think, where we'll have a bit of a rage at the system, maybe. Yeah. So,
yeah. Well, it's a very broken, harmful system, and I'm not pleased with it. But it's nice to hear about people doing work like doing that kind of activist work because I think and yeah, and I'm so excited also for your conversation with your pediatrician.
yeah,
That's a lot of great
yeah,
stuff coming up.
yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah, one of these days we'll talk about anniversaries, which I also think will be really fun. And today we were trying to figure out. We wanted to talk about this article that we're gonna post. We'll post it, the one we've been talking about, and we thought maybe we would connect it to anniversaries, but then we get busy talking about all kinds of
Be like,
things.
yeah, in years' time when it comes around to next anniversary, we'll talk about it then. We'll get around to it in the
I
end.
know,
So.
like I'm at my 10-year anniversary. This is like your year. Are you
Well,
year 6 or 5?
I've just gone
At
past 6. Yeah, just gone past 6.
6,
So yeah,
yeah. For as
yeah.
an adult, I mean, you had
As an
Emmy as a
adult, so yeah,
kid, but
I figured out it's about a quarter of my life now.
yeah,
Yeah, in total. So yeah, but it's like 14 years altogether, something like that. 13 something.
it's a
Yeah.
lot. That's a lot of
Oh, that's more than
years.
a quarter. That's more than a quarter of my life. Yeah.
I guess for me, it's like a fifth of my life because I'm 53 and I hit 10, and I just hit 10 years.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to know
Yeah.
like exactly when. I know when I got the flu, like that's a very clear date. I got the flu on New Year's Eve, on the Gregorian New Year. But as far as like developing ME, it happened kind of, I don't know, like I, right away after the flu, I had really bad brain fog and a lot of ME like symptoms, but I don't know. I didn't get my first diagnosis until like, I think May or June. So I don't know.
Mm,
Anyways,
mm,
that can be something we talk about in our anniversaries podcast is how we even try to define like when we got it because it's not always entirely clear. Um,
yeah.
anyways, anything else that
No, I think hopefully by the time we've got this one out, the one with Amy Arthur will come out. I had a good discussion with her about her pacing book. Um, and also going to be speaking to Becky Holmes, who's written a book called Keanu Reeves is not in love with you, and that's all about online romantic fraud, which is fascinating. And she's just going to sort of share it. So it's a completely different sort of kind of conversation, but it'll be interesting in her sharing her experiences of living with Emmy and writing and exploring that kind of world as well. So looking forward to speaking to her next week. And yeah, so lots of bits and bobs coming up. So do keep listening. Do comment, share,
yeah.
subscribe if you're not subscribed, because lots of people kind of maybe watch episodes but aren't subscribed. So if you subscribe, you'll get updates about when we've put out new episodes. Yeah, it's all a bit random. I don't kind of we don't have sort of like a set day that we put out stuff. It's just when I've got the brain energy to actually sit down at a laptop and write a description and put a thumbnail together for episodes. So do apologize. It's not kind of like every set amount of time, but yeah, when it comes out, you'll get it to listen to. So or watch on YouTube. So yeah, thanks for listening, and we'll speak soon.
Ciao.
Bye.